Last week, people were so upset when we said to sell Devon Achane for either Jefferson, Chase, or Amon-Ra St. Brown. Excited to see what upsets y'all this week, but we're going to talk about a player at least at every single position, starting with the sell high at quarterback. Now, I don't want to sit here and act like Dak Prescott isn't a good NFL quarterback. I don't want to act like Dak Prescott can't be a mid QB1 in fantasy, but actually looking at the traits I'm seeing with Dak Prescott right now, I actually wouldn't mind going out there and trying to sell him high after a massive blow-up game against the Baltimore Ravens. Against the Baltimore Ravens, you actually had 379 passing yards from Dak Prescott. You actually had multiple passing touchdowns, and at the same time, you had the rushing touchdown from Dak. So Dak's coming off one of the best games that we have seen in fantasy football at the quarterback position with almost 30 total points against the Ravens. And projecting this out going into the future, I'm actually going to have a pretty hard time with it. The reason being is if you are looking at Dak Prescott here, the underlying issue that we have seen with this Dallas Cowboys offense has nothing to do with CeeDee Lamb. It has everything to do with the wide receiver 2, 3, 4. It's a bad offense beyond Lamb. The depth here just is abysmal, where we're talking about Jalen Tolbert potentially being an interesting pickup. And this should limit the overall actual upside that we have to see the passing volume in Dallas outside of these games where the Dallas Cowboys are going to get just completely boat raced as they did with the Baltimore Ravens. And in that environment where you get 51 pass attempts for Dak Prescott, then yes, he's going to be just fine. But most games aren't going to look like that. Most games, Dak isn't going to have the rushing upside either. So honestly, I'm kind of viewing Dak a little bit more as a streaming option, where if I were to compare him to other guys like Jared Goff, Jordan Love, I think that they're in a very similar tier, right? The quarterbacks that can possibly have a lot of passing volume, but underlying that, they're not going to have the rushing upside to go along with it. And really, they're going to be QBs that you're going to play dependent on their respective matchups. So if you look at Dak Prescott in my rest of season rankings over there on flockfantasy.com, I actually have Dak as QB 12. I'm directly behind Jordan Love as well as Jared Goff, where it looks like most experts on the site have Dak Prescott much higher than these two other QBs. But honestly, I wouldn't advise you to go out there and try to just sell Dak Prescott for Jared Goff straight up. They're all about the same for me. But instead, if Dak Prescott's your QB1, I want to more so look at this through the lens of, how much worse would it be to just stream based off matchup? How much worse would it be to just go pick up Brock Purdy off the waiver wire? Go pick up Kirk Cousins off the waiver wire and just play these QBs from a week-to-week perspective that are in a good matchup, but maybe you don't love for the long term. Now, of course, you're not going to be able to do that in a league where every single team rosters two quarterbacks. Because if every single team rosters two quarterbacks, then at that point, obviously, it's going to be very difficult to play the waiver wire. But if you're in a league where there is 16, 17 quarterbacks out there on waivers, I'm actually fine just looking to stream. And if we can use Dak Prescott to get an upgrade somewhere else in our starting lineup, like going through and using the trade finder over there on flockfantasy.com, this is completely free. You can go ahead and pull it up whenever you want. I mean, there are a ton of instances where people ask me, Mason, what can I get for Bijan Robinson? Well, literally just go to the trade calculator, put Bijan Robinson, hit enter, and you will see every trade that's been made that day, yesterday, the day before in real fantasy football leagues involving Bijan Robinson. But nonetheless, we see that here Deontay Johnson and Zach Moss were traded for Dak Prescott, Aaron Jones. Honestly, if I'm looking at Aaron Jones Moss, I'd rather have Jones, but it's a slight downgrade there. And you're getting Deontay Johnson for selling Dak Prescott. That's the type of deal I'm looking to make. Somebody was able to sell Dak Prescott straight up for Tank Dell. Somebody was able to use Dak Prescott as a sweetener to pivot up from DJ Moore to Tyreek Hill. Absolutely love that pivot. Somebody was able to use Dak Prescott as a sweetener to pivot up from J.K. Dobbins to Derrick Henry. And then somebody was able to get Anthony Richardson, Keon Coleman, and Xavier Worthy. Obviously, a straight up robbery there if you are selling Dak. But ultimately, I do want to reiterate, when we're selling Dak Prescott here, it's specifically in a league where you would feel comfortable streaming off of waivers. And instead, you're going to go through and you're just going to get an upgrade elsewhere in your starting lineup, preferably in that 2-for-1 deal where you upgrade from like J.K. Dobbins to Derrick Henry by just having to pay up Dak Prescott. But let's go over to the running back position. Now, I want to be very clear, very similar to what we said with Devon Achane last week. People said they were unsubscribing. Jonathan Taylor is a phenomenal running back. I actually have Jonathan Taylor in a lot of underdog drafts. I hope Jonathan Taylor continues to absolutely crush it throughout the rest of the season. And if you look at my rankings over there on flockfantasy.com, I have Jonathan Taylor as a mid running back 1. I have him right alongside Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, and Alvin Kamara. And honestly, if you're looking at that little group of running backs, I think it's up to you and your personal preference in a full PPR format of who you'd prefer. But my issue with Jonathan Taylor is that in a full PPR format, you're just not simply getting the receiving volume that would give him that nice floor. And instead, we are pretty much just hunting touchdowns. And when touchdowns are there, Jonathan Taylor is going to be a really good running back in fantasy like he was this past week, where this past week you actually get 110 rushing yards, multiple rushing touchdowns, drops 27 points, and looks like the freaking man. And obviously at this point, he's only gotten better this season. He goes from 10 points to 15 points to 26 points. He's looked great. But in that full PPR format, at the same time, Jonathan Taylor's only had 3 receptions out of the backfield this season. And on top of this, if you are looking at JT, this is a situation in which we should probably expect, while Anthony Richardson obviously is not a great quarterback, that Anthony Richardson is going to take some of these rushing touchdowns at the goal line going into the future. So if I could pivot off of Jonathan Taylor on a team where I have more than enough running back production, and I can go get a player like Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, honestly, maybe even Jamar Chase, I think that is something that I personally would look to do. And honestly, with Jonathan Taylor this week, with a brutal matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, where we can go ahead and we can look at what the Steelers have actually held opposing running backs to so far this season. I mean, you go and see what they did to J.K. Dobbins, where they limit Dobbins to 44 rushing yards. You see what they did to the Denver Broncos, where Bo Nix was the leading rusher with 25 rushing yards. You see what they did to the Atlanta Falcons, where they limited Bijan to 68 rushing yards. I actually don't mind taking the lower on Jonathan Taylor on Underdog this week at 88.5 total yards. I think just because it's a brutal matchup going up against the Steelers, and the receiving floor isn't going to be there for him. But of course, if you wanted to say, Mason, you're crazy, I'm going to go with the higher than 88.5 total yards on Underdog, you can find that link in the description, in the comment section. If you use promo code FLOCK over there on Underdog Fantasy, you're actually going to get a free Patrick Mahomes pick for Sunday, more than less than half a total yard. And if you sign up before the Thursday night game, you're going to get an additional free Dak Prescott pick, more than less than half a total yard. You're regardless going to get 2 free picks with code FLOCK. You'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. And on top of that, you'll actually get a free team review through flockfantasy.com and the live streams that we are doing every single night. Just make sure you go through the link in the description or the comment section. But looking at some of these trades that have involved JT, somebody managed to trade Terry McLaurin and Jonathan Taylor up to Saquon Barkley. I actually really like a move like that, because with Barkley, where you're seeing the involvement as a receiver that you're not getting from Taylor. Somebody was able to pivot from Jonathan Taylor and Jackson Smith-Njigba to Nick Chubb, CeeDee Lamb. That's another great example of pivoting over to that elite receiver in a full PPR league. Somebody was able to pivot from Taylor and Singletary to CeeDee Lamb here as well. Somebody pivoted from Taylor and Flowers to Lamb. There are a lot of CeeDee Lamb trades, but nonetheless, that's going to be the move that I'm looking to make, similar to what we said with Achane last week, where we're trying to pivot over to one of those elite alpha wide receivers that maybe doesn't have the red flag that you're seeing with the lack of receiving usage for Taylor in this offense. Now let's go over to a running back that I've been a massive believer in for a very long time, and it pains for me to tell you to sell him. But Zach Charbonnet is a very interesting sell here. Now, obviously, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, Mason, my league mates are smart. They know that Kenneth Walker's coming back. And yeah, if you can't sell Charbonnet for a premium, then of course, I think he's the perfect guy to roster, because if you are desperate, you could go out there, you could put him in your starting lineup. He's going to have a role from a week-to-week perspective. I mean, you can go back and look at week 1 when Kenneth Walker was healthy. He did have 3 targets out of the backfield. He had 8 attempts as well. So I actually think that, yeah, Charbonnet is going to see about 10 opportunities a game, even when Kenneth Walker is healthy. And if you're desperate during a bye week, if you have an injury, that's a player that you can throw into your running back 2 slot. But the vast majority of value, of course, and what we've always said, is there with it hidden handcuff appeal, where if Walker were to go down, Charbonnet immediately steps in and sees 90+% of the backfield opportunities and dominates as a 3-down workhorse. And that's exactly what we had over the past 2 weeks, where Charbonnet was ranked as a top 10 running back for us, and he would be again this week if it wasn't for Walker coming back in, where he had 25 points. He had 18 points. But I actually was surprised to see in the live stream that a lot of Zach Charbonnet trades that people were sending us had him priced out as if this was somebody that you were going to be excited to start going into the future, which I just simply don't think is the case when you do have Kenneth Walker coming back into this offense. Like looking at this, somebody was able to trade Zach Charbonnet for Jonathan Brooks. I think the long-term upside of Brooks makes it so much better off to pivot over there. Somebody was able to use Zach Charbonnet and Sam Laporta to tier up to Derrick Henry. As somebody who has Sam Laporta in the Flock League and Sam Laporta in a lot of underdog drafts, it pains me to say, but yeah, we probably want Henry there. Somebody pivoted off of Zach Charbonnet to Najee Harris. I think that's a great pivot. Somebody pivoted from Charbonnet and Khalil Shakir to Devontae Adams. And yeah, I want to be very clear too, with the trade finder on flockfantasy.com, this isn't just trades that people put into the trade calculator. No, these are trades from real fantasy football leagues that have occurred, not just offers, trades that have actually gotten done. And whenever I tell you to sell a player, it doesn't mean that you absolutely have to sell him and you have to sell him for whatever you can get. It's like, okay, if you can get a trade that looks like this, if you can pivot up in our rankings where you see Charbonnet as the RB30 in the site in the rest of season ranks, and instead you could pivot over to Jonathan Brooks, Nick Chubb, Devin Singletary, I think that could be interesting. Now let's go over to Rachaad White. Now to be very clear, if you're playing in a league where people know what's up, they're probably not trading for Rachaad White. And the reason being is obviously he's been the least efficient running back in the NFL outside of DeAndre Swift through the first 3 weeks. He's been horrendous. Bucky Irving has played better. We actually had a report coming out where this coaching staff, however, was saying, you know what, Bucky Irving has been playing well because we gave him good play calls. Rachaad White, our play calls weren't good enough. It's not like Bucky Irving's out playing White, which looks very funny whenever you're sitting here with Rachaad White. 2.07 yards per carry week 1, 1.8 yards per carry week 2, 2.83 yards per carry week 3. And even the overall efficiency hasn't been there as a receiver, where you're sitting with the total of 13 targets this season. And with those 13 targets, you have not cracked 100 total receiving yards either. So I personally am expecting that we are going to get the continued expanded role for Bucky Irving in this offense going into the future. I think Rachaad White's receiving floor still does give him a little bit of viability in a full PPR format, but I do currently have him as RB23 in our rest of season ranks. I have him right in the same range as Tony Pollard, Najee Harris, and J.K. Dobbins. And if you're looking at some of the recent trades that people have made regarding Rachaad White, somebody was able to tier up from Rachaad White to Kyron Williams by really just having to tier down from Mike Evans to Calvin Ridley. I think that's a very interesting move. Somebody was able to somehow put a bunch of small pieces together to get to Breece Hall, or somebody traded Terry McLaurin, Rachaad White, Kenneth Walker for Breece Hall and Jalen Warren. That's immaculate. Somebody pivoted off of Rachaad White to Brandon Ayuk. I'd rather have Ayuk in the long term as well. And somebody pivoted from Rachaad White to Joe Mixon. Coming off the injury, I would prefer Mixon too. Now let's go over to another running back that's just absolutely crushed this week. Chuba Hubbard just gave you 28 points against the Las Vegas Raiders. He looked phenomenal, not only as a rusher, where he had 114 rushing yards off of 21 carries, but he also looked phenomenal as a receiver, where the man had 55 receiving yards off of 5 targets. And I do want to be on record where I think that this should be an offense that is much better going into the future. I mean, if you're looking at the implied team total that you have here for the Carolina Panthers this next week, right now, sportsbooks are saying they're going to score about 20, 21, 21 and a half points. And if that's the case, the projections are significantly higher with Carolina, obviously, than they were under Bryce Young. But with Hubbard, as soon as Jonathan Brooks is in here, you can't start him a single week. As soon as Jonathan Brooks is in, it's going to be the Brooks show. Maybe his first week in here, Chuba Hubbard splits his backfield and sees 40% of the opportunities. But even if he's just a 50-50 back in Carolina, he's not talented enough to really be viable in that instance. So if you could make that trade before Jonathan Brooks is back, I'd really like it. Chuba Hubbard versus Xavier Worthy was a deal that we saw go down. Hubbard, Caleb Williams versus Tank Dell. Hubbard, George Pickens versus Jahmyr Gibbs. I think, honestly, I really prefer the other side in every single one of those. Now, let's go over to the wide receiver position. And I know people are going to lose their minds when I say this, and I completely understand why, but hear me out. Malik Neighbors was a buy low candidate for us after week 1. After week 1, where he comes out, scores 11 fantasy points in a tough spot against the Minnesota Vikings, where you have Daniel Jones just absolutely imploding, We came out and we said he's the talent, and now we get the confirmation that he has the role that you're looking for, where he plays 100% of the snaps week 1. He sees the vast majority of targets, and he is the alpha wide receiver. He is for sure a buy low candidate. I'm ranking him out there as a mid wide receiver 2 rest of season. Well, now that is no longer the expectation with Malik Nabers. Now the expectations with Malik Nabers is he's a borderline top 5 wide receiver rest of season. And I completely understand why people are coming away with this take. He's a rookie receiver that over the past 2 weeks has dropped almost 57 points. He is at the very top of points scored at the wide receiver position so far this year. He's doing it with volume as well, where he's had 37 targets through the first 3 weeks of this season. It is insane what Malik Nabers is doing. I want to be on record and say that Malik Nabers, 2 years down the road, has a chance to be the most talented receiver in the entire NFL. It's absurd. And at the same time, Daniel Jones has looked better over the past 2 weeks than he did last year, than he did in week 1. Like, Daniel Jones is looking like he may be turning the corner, and this may not be the worst offense in the NFL, the second worst offense in the NFL. It looks like it may just be an average to below average offense, which obviously would be a massive smash spot for Malik Nabers. So I honestly didn't expect to include him on this video until we started doing those live Q&As through flockfantasy.com every night, where the trades that I was getting sent with Malik Nabers really kind of took me back. We're looking at a lot of these trades through flockfantasy.com with the trade finder. We're seeing Malik Nabers and Darnell Mooney get traded for Amon-Ra St. Brown. We're seeing Malik Nabers get traded for Justin Jefferson. We're seeing Malik Nabers get traded for Tyreek Hill. And honestly, at this price point, I just want to reset the expectations. And that Malik Nabers for sure is the wide receiver 1 rest of season. I currently have him as my wide receiver 10, ranked right alongside A.J. Brown, Nico Collins, and Marvin Harrison Jr. Even though this Giants offense has looked much better over the past 2 weeks, it is still a situation in which if we can pivot to a receiver that's in a good offense that we have a much larger sample with, where if we can pivot over to somebody like CeeDee Lamb and only have to throw in a little piece like Darnell Mooney, it is an absolute no-brainer. Now, I know a lot of y'all play in leagues where that's not going to be possible, and they're cool. Keep Malik Nabers. I think he's a top 10 option. But specifically, where we're seeing some of these deals get done, I think it does potentially make sense to pivot over to one of those elite young receivers like Jefferson, like I would take Chase over Nabers. Like, just to make sure we're on the same page here. If you have Malik Nabers and could send him for Jamar Chase, I would. I just think the quarterback play is going to be so much better there in the long run. Now let's go over to another wide receiver that has just been absolutely dominant. Let's look at Chris Godwin. Godwin through the first 3 weeks is at the very top of fantasy football in total points scored. He's had 3 touchdowns. He's sitting here with over 200 yards, almost at 250 yards through the first 3 weeks. Actually, I think he is exactly at 250 something yards. He's been great. But if we are looking at the underlying involvement in this offense, a couple different things stand out. One, the matchups he has played in. The first week against Washington, by far and away, the best defense to go up against at any point if you're a receiver in fantasy. 2, against the Detroit Lions, this is a Lions defense that you cannot run the ball against. If you're going up against Detroit, your only option is to air it out. Then 3, played the Denver Broncos, where Mike Evans drew the very tough lockdown corner, and Godwin was able to operate out of the slot, and Godwin was able to see the vast majority of targets here. So I think through the first 3 weeks, it has set up perfectly for Chris Godwin. The usage in the slot looks great. This looks like vintage Chris Godwin. And I'm not saying he's going to go back to who he was last year. Not saying he's going to go back to who he was 2 years ago when he was out there as a wide receiver 3/wide receiver 4 option. I think that Chris Godwin looks to be a high-end wide receiver 2 rest of season. But if we are just doing some simple math here and looking at a touchdown rate that has Godwin scoring a touchdown currently on 13% of his targets, and we look at his historical norm where his touchdown rate typically is a lot closer to 5 to 6%, where Mike Evans typically is that player scoring touchdowns in this offense, I think that may still be the case going into the future. Like I said, I'm still viewing Godwin as that mid to high-end wide receiver 2, where I have him ranked alongside guys like Chris Olave, Deebo Samuel, Devonta Smith. but I actually maybe wouldn't mind pivoting from Godwin to somebody like Chris Olave, or looking at some of these other trades that we have seen through flockfantasy.com, where somebody was able to trade Godwin and in return get back Etienne and Tony Pollard. Somebody was able to trade Godwin and Carson Steele and in return get back Tyreek Hill. Somebody was able to trade Godwin and in return get back Joe Mixon. And somebody was able to package Godwin and Charbonnet to pivot over to that true elite receiver in CeeDee Lamb. Now let's move over to the last position I want to talk about. And let's look at what we have with Dallas Goedert. Now with Dallas Goedert, I want to reiterate, this week, he is going to absolutely crush. If you check out my tight end rankings over there on the site, or they'll drop on YouTube tomorrow, you'll see that this week, I'm more likely not going to have Dallas Goedert solely as a top 5 tight end, as a locked and loaded elite option at a position that has been absolutely decimated from top to bottom. But if we are thinking long-term here with Dallas Goedert and trying to reasonably project out the actual market share numbers that we should see, the realistic situation is once we get A.J. Brown back into this offense, once you get Devonta Smith back into this offense, you're going to see the target share come down dramatically for Goedert. In the game where Devonta Smith left about halfway through and you had no A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert saw 11 targets. Week 1, where you actually had a fully healthy A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, Goedert there, 5 targets. Week 2, where Smith plays the entire game, Goedert, 4 targets. You go back to 2023 and we look at these samples historically. While yes, the offensive coordinator has changed and maybe that's going to boost up Goedert just a bit, the reality of the situation is he's probably a low-end tight end 1 rest of the season. The guys that I have him ranked alongside are Jake Ferguson, Kyle Pitts, and Sam Laporta. Looking at some of these trades where people sold Dallas Goedert, somebody was able to sell Goedert and Daniels for Tyreek, no-brainer. Somebody sold Dallas Goedert for Josh Jacobs, no-brainer. Somebody sold Goedert for Kelsey, then Etienne, Chuba, Bigsby for Bijan, no-brainer. Somebody sold Goedert, Rachaad White, Quentin Johnston for Brandon Ayuk, J.K. Dobbins. And really, this looks like somebody just kind of sold Dallas Goedert and Quentin Johnston for Brandon Ayuk. Also, I think that is a no-brainer. Main spot where you'd want to sell Goedert, of course, is if you're sitting here with both like Dallas Goedert and Jake Ferguson, where you do have a viable tight end to pivot to if you do ship Goedert off your squad. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much for being a member of the Flock supporting the channel. Again, if you wanted to check out that trade finder, it's for free over there on flockfantasy.com. You can use it literally whenever you want. And also, if you want to get a free team review through flockfantasy.com, or you want to be getting that free Patrick Mahomes pick more than less than half a total yard for Sunday night, the free Dak Prescott pick more than less than half a total yard for Thursday night, you can use promo code FLOCK with the link in the description and comment section over there on Underdog Fantasy. Code FLOCK will give you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. It'll get you both of those free pick'ems, and it will get you a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. You just have to make sure you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog. That way I can go through and I can accredit you with that free team review voucher. But that's all I got for you. I really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day, and really hope I get to hang out with you after the game in the live stream tonight.